what's important is that spirituality or some people's Christian theology could be negative or distorted or kind of defensive as well. That
Mm,
some of our religious and spiritual principles could actually shy us away from emotional pain, emotional experience as well.
mm,
And so, for example, that compassion or self compassion, it could be kind of twisted to suggest that we must never think about ourselves and we must always think about the other person at the expense of yourself.
Welcome to the Cross Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Joel Jen is an affiliate faculty at Sentio University's Marriage and Family Therapy graduate program and an upcoming acting assistant professor at University of Washington's Department of Family Medicine. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Graduate School of Psychology and an MA in theology and ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. He was an assistant professor at Seattle Pacific University's Department of Clinical Psychology for the past 4 years. Joel is a co-author of Deliberate Practice and Multicultural Therapy, recently published by the American Psychological Association's Essentials in Deliberate Practice book series. Welcome, Joel.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for being on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversations. Obviously, I know you from your time at SPU and our conversations and our collaborations, but I'm really happy that we get to talk about our work and also your sort of your personal connections to the work that you're doing. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate the time to be able to talk about this with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll jump into the questions right away. As I noted already, you and I have collaborated on several different projects. One article that we collaborated on focused on self-compassion among Asian Americans. And you've also written about self-compassion with your team as well. So
Mhm.
maybe we can start with what is self-compassion and why is it important for psychological outcomes like well-being and help-seeking behaviors?
Yeah, self compassion, as it's been defined by Western psychologists and researchers, has three main components. And this is related to Dr. Kristen Neff's work. So, the first part that's important to know about self compassion is this kindness towards oneself, especially during times of suffering or emotional pain. The second part is that all this human experience that I have is also connected to the larger human experience, and particularly around suffering and emotional pain. This is just part of everyone's story to being human.
Mm,
And then the third part is the sense of balance or equanimity during suffering. Like we have this balanced perspective or approach that we are in pain, and yet also there might be some silver lining to what we're going through.
mm,
So there's three components to self-compassion as we know it in psychological science.
mm,
And it's significant and important to study because it's correlated, positively correlated with lots of really good outcome indicators. And also from our research and some of the research that I've done with my team at Seattle Pacific University is that self-compassion is positively correlated with help-seeking attitudes and behaviors.
mm,
Meaning that when someone identifies as being more self-compassionate, they have more positive or favorable attitudes to seek out professional help for the mental health care.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense that you are, because you want to practice kindness to yourself, then you're open to the idea of taking care of yourself by seeking out professional services. Thank you for that summary. You and I, we both grew up in a Christian and a Korean context. And I know that there are also differences there, even in the Korean Christian backgrounds that we grew up in. But when I was growing up, this idea of self-compassion was rarely, if at all, brought up. And I would argue that if I were to place myself like in my past, something like self-compassion would be viewed as almost antithetical to faithful Christian and maybe even Korean living. Have you gotten similar kinds of messaging before? And how might you respond to something like that? How might you maybe suggest that folks counter these narratives?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And yes, I've had similar kinds of messages before in Korean context, in Christian context. in Korean Christian context as well. So there's three different contexts that are very similar. And so you have both of these contexts, and it might be kind of like a double header, a double
Mm,
negative
mm,
in thinking about self-compassion. So within Christian contexts, and there's a variety of Christian contexts out there, but I think
mm.
sometimes what's more emphasized is the word compassion,
Right.
to suffer with, to think about how we suffer with people, how we empathize. I think pastors would quickly point to Philippians 2 to talk about how Jesus like emptied himself
Mm,
to become more human and became human and lived with us, died, and then that's what it means to show love, the self-sacrifice.
mhm.
And I think that's important, what the literature on self-compassion suggests. And I think if we're to actually dive deeper into what self-compassion or even compassion means, is that we do need to have some healthy sense of self,
Mm,
that there's some kind of empowerment or privilege or giftings that we recognize that we do have in order to offer that to other people as well.
mm.
I think also within the Korean context, there's this emphasis
Right.
on service
Mm,
and responsibility, and also wanting to serve other people before oneself. And I think sometimes that can become a bit distorted or
mhm.
reinforced in a negative way where someone doesn't consider, okay, well, I've done everything for everyone except myself.
Mm,
When is it time for me to care for myself or just take a pause or even say something like, no, not right now. I can't help you. And I think that individual empowerment to say, not right now, or no, thank you, or could you ask someone else, whether you're Korean, whether you're Christian, whether you're Korean Christian, and that takes a lot of courage.
right.
That takes a lot of positive reinforcement of, hey, it's okay for you to say what you think and what you need.
Mm,
And you certainly need a community or relationships to reinforce, like, hey, I really appreciate you sharing that. Like, ah, it's too bad that you can't help me today, but that's okay as well.
right. This is really good, helpful way for me to talk to people if they ask about this idea of self-compassion. As you were talking, Joel, I was reminded of the importance of healthy boundaries and how not in a selfish way, not in a way that cuts out people, but more as a way to say, right now, like I need to do something to take care of myself so that later on I can be even more helpful to others. And I think that's maybe easier said than done, but I think that kind of thinking about taking care of oneself as also helpful to other people is an important component of this.
Yeah, I agree. I think about an infant or a baby coming into this world.
Mm,
The baby, when it is hungry, not it, when the baby is hungry, when the baby
mhm.
is thirsty, when the baby needs their diaper changed or whatnot,
Right. Mhm.
it doesn't think to oneself that I'm selfish for crying and protesting and
Mm,
asking my caregivers to come to my need. It's only through time and the world and the relationships that they tell the baby that you are being selfish now
mm,
for asking for your need. And so you compound that over time, and then you're steeped in maybe a Korean immigrant culture, a Christian culture that reinforces that message. And the person will learn at some point that, oh, it is selfish for me to ask what I need
mhm.
or to at least express what I need. And then perhaps we could have some bargaining or negotiation of each other's needs. And so I think when when one is in a culture, or community, or family, or church setting, whatever that might be, that just takes, and then says, "Hey, you're selfish,"
Yeah.
or "Could you give more?" or "Can't you think about other people?" It really can reinforce someone's individual story of, well, maybe I can't say what I need, and that can be really problematic too.
Yes, yes. I'm glad you brought up the word selfish because that's often the response I get when I introduce the idea of self-compassion.
Mhm.
Early on, you said, Joel, that in the Christian context, it's really common to talk about compassion or compassion directed toward others.
Mhm.
But this idea of self-compassion is labeled as being selfish. And
Mhm.
it's ironic too, because in your definition of self-compassion, you mentioned this sense of connectedness to the world, to humanity, to other people suffering as being also an important part of self-compassion. And
Mhm,
to me, when I think about that particular aspect, there is such a strong sort of connectedness or interdependence that's emphasized in that definition of self-compassion. So I think part of this is maybe sort of demystifying the idea of self-compassion or
mhm,
providing an accurate definition when
mhm.
people question the usage and its application.
Yeah, that's really important to connect self-compassion to interdependence and other people, and to kind of decouple or de-link self-compassion to selfishness. Because when we do that, and this has happened within psychological science and the secularization of self-compassion. Like when we look at religious traditions of maybe Buddhism or even Christianity of what it means to be compassionate to oneself and others, that's always connected.
Right.
When we can be connected to other people and connected to ourselves, we are living in harmony. We have some kind of interdependence. And it could be hyper individualism, or it could
Mm,
just be how science works, or at least clinical psychology focusing on the individual. But we've really used self compassion as a way to focus on ourselves to the point where we might be deeming ourselves as more selfish. Like we think about
right.
ourselves a little bit too much,
Hmm. Hmm.
which can be important for some people to learn. But again, if we overcorrect, then we lose the aspect of compassion and self compassion where we want to be in connection with other people as well. And so
Yeah.
I think that's a great point that you bring up.
Yeah. I'm like taking mental notes already, thinking about everything that we're talking about. I, I, I mean, I've shared with you and I've written publicly about caring for my mother who is in a permanent vegetative state and is in Korea in a hospital. And when I reflect on the idea of self-compassion and connect it to caregiving for family members, especially long distance, I've just found it personally helpful to think about self-compassion and
Yeah.
to know my own limits as a way to counter the guilty feelings that might come up because of caregiving or the lack of caregiving that I'm able to do. But self-compassion brings me back to one, kindness toward myself, but also two, that I'm not the only one going through something like this. And there are other people in the world who share in similar kind of experiences. And so just personally, I found the idea of self-compassion to be helpful to counter feelings of guilt as a caregiver. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, so many people like you suffer from real emotional pain. I mean,
Mm,
all this emotional pain is real, and could be a close loved one or maybe a
mm,
spouse who's going through suffering from mental illness or some kind of chronic pain. Like when you talk about your mom, I think about my mom as well
mm,
because she passed from liver cancer in 2018. And I was away in California for graduate school at that time, whereas my dad and my younger brother were mostly around home doing more of the
mhm,
caretaking. And I remember coming back for maybe about a month. I was kind of late. I kind of delayed that visit
mm,
back home and trying to care for my mom. It was so demanding and it was so tiring and emotionally exhausting. And I kind of developed this like hyper vigilance as well. So like
mm,
any little creak in the house, I would think
right.
that my mom needed something.
Mhm,
And the morning after she passed and she
mm,
died, I remember sleeping in
mm,
because I would wake up maybe like 6, 7 a.m. to
right.
care for my mom.
Mm,
And so the morning after she passed, I would wake up. I slept in and I
mm,
felt so rested.
mm,
And I felt this kind of like, oh, I don't have to do anything. And then I felt so much shame and guilt for feeling
mm,
that because like I was quite tired. Then I thought like, well, how tired do you think your dad was? Or how tired do you think your mom was? And so yeah, I think a lot of times there's this self criticism or
mhm,
coldness. There's this guilt tripping or shaming. And it, what it ultimately does, it just blocks my love for my mom or for other
mm,
people. Like it just kind
mm,
of makes me avoid some deeper feelings of love and mourning
mm,
and grief.
mm,
And so I remember that whole time, and I know I might be hard with you and your mom, but like I know my mom when she was still alive, she would just, like the one thing she would say is like, just be grateful for the time that we had. Be
mm,
grateful that like we were in Canada and we didn't have to pay for surgery and chemotherapy.
Mm,
And she would always say that throughout our lives. But when she was saying that in a time of suffering,
right.
that brought up a lot of sorrow and grief and love as well,
Mm,
because it wasn't a kind of thin, like, well, let's just be thinking about the positive things, but let's, within our suffering, let's
yeah.
also have this other perspective,
Mm,
which seems so wild, so out of possibility, but let's also hold the possibility that we actually have still some time together.
mm,
And in those times when my mom was sick and she would say, okay, well, let's be grateful, we would be crying as she's saying that too. And she would be
wow.
crying too, because we're just holding so many big feelings together.
Right. Oh, that's so powerful. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing. So many things I'm reflecting on as you're sharing, but one thing I'm thinking about these days is this idea of something we talk a lot about, which is holding things in tension, that
Mm,
there are contradictory things that it's not one comes and then the other comes. They might be happening simultaneously. So I think about your description of crying, but also naming the things you're thankful for at the same time. And how in the scripture it talks about there's a time to mourn and a time to laugh, but maybe like sometimes those times overlap in a way that like I've certainly experienced that with our family situation as well, where gosh, like my mother's in this situation,
yeah,
then there's celebrations with other aspects of my life. And how do I hold those things in tension? Or my mother's in this situation, but sometimes as a family, we do things for fun, like go on vacations. And how do you wrestle with the guilt of that or the potential guilt of, oh, like how can we take a break or a vacation while my mother is suffering? And I think self-compassion is something that I often come back to.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so much that to what you're saying, and
Right.
so much resonates with my story, and I'm sure others
Mm,
people as well. Because one of the pieces is, as parents, and I've heard this from my mom and my dad, more my dad these days.
mm,
But he says, "Hey, don't feel guilty for not being close to me. Don't feel guilty
mm,
for needing help in certain ways. Like, I just want you to be grateful.
mm.
If you're guilty, then it seems like what I've given you, what I've sacrificed, doesn't mean as much."
Wow.
And so sometimes my dad and I, if we're on the phone and he's in Toronto, I'm here in
Mm,
Seattle, and
mm,
if we're more down and things aren't going our ways, then we start to feel guilty. Like I say, "Oh, well, I wish I was there with you and I could support you." And he says, "Well, I wish I could come over there, or like
mm,
give you more financial help, or like more emotional help, whatever that might be."
mm,
And so the other day, actually just the other day, I was like, and we both agreed of, hey, let's not guilt ourselves so much.
mm,
Let's be grateful for what we do have. Let's be
mm,
grateful that we have a relationship where we can talk. Let's be grateful for our health, whatever we do have. The other piece that you had touched on, which I think is so important, is when we're in a place of rest and we
mm,
can kind of break from emotional pain that's ongoing.
mm,
I think we also need time to laugh. We need time to mourn. We also need time to protest and express anger as well.
mhm, mhm.
And sometimes we've learned, maybe it's from, at least for me, it's from my Korean immigrant background, it's from my Christian background.
Yeah.
It's a little mix of both, but I just have a tendency to express anger back towards myself.
Mm,
I kind of like inflict aggression and pain. And I don't mean that physically, but I just
mm.
mean that like psychologically. Like I'm
Sure.
much more critical of myself
Mhm.
when I feel angry, not really at myself, but just something about the world.
Right.
And so catching myself when I am shaming myself or criticizing myself, or or like guilt tripping myself, that
Mm,
perhaps I'm feeling angry underneath,
mm,
and I need actually healthy ways to direct that outward.
mhm, mhm.
I think many people could relate, where I just like, maybe they're like me, where they're much more critical of themselves and they're angry towards themselves rather than
Right.
kind of out into the world.
Yeah, yeah. So it speaks to the importance of learning good emotion regulation skills, good anger management skills.
Yes.
I I know we're getting really deep into this, but I also want to talk a little bit about because you used the word guilt and I use the word guilt and how closely related in the Korean culture is this idea of social obligation. And
Mm,
like of course, we do things because we want to, but also there are times when we do things because we're obligated to. And my parents often talked about this, where they felt guilty. They felt badly that this other family had done us a favor, and therefore it's their turn to do a favor for them. And again, you can think of that as obligation, maybe sort of a honor or shame-based culture, but also guilt is a very strong emotion in that context. And so I guess I just wanted to pick your brain on, like, what are your thoughts on guilt as a legitimate emotion? As a clinical psychologist, as someone who studies the effects of these cultural constructs on well-being, like, should we be helping people get rid of guilt all the time? Or do you have a more nuanced perspective on this?
Sure. Yeah. I appreciate those examples.
Mm,
I don't think we can get rid of guilt. I think
mm,
guilt is a helpful emotion to feel. There are social implications of
mm,
when we're in some kind of relationship, whether that's explicit or not.
mm.
Maybe it's just another human being,
Yeah.
or there's some kind of romantic relationship or some family relationship. I think the feeling of guilt helps us understand that perhaps we did something to offend another person,
Mhm,
break that social relational contract.
mm,
And I don't feel good about that. And I actually want to come back towards you and reconnect.
right.
And I think in the healthy sense, guilt, when you feel that, it does lead back to connection.
Mm,
I've done something wrong. I've said something that might have hurt you. I didn't fulfill something about this relationship that was my responsibility, or at least someone had given me this responsibility.
right.
And so when we can tolerate that guilt in a healthy sense, it often does, like, it gives us the energy and the action potential to say, whoa, I missed that. I'm so
Yes.
sorry. Let me make that up to you.
Right.
And I think guilt is a really powerful feeling. It's really hard to feel that. And so we kind of do everything that we can to avoid that
Mhm,
guilty feeling. Now you can magnify that guilt to egregious crimes, and
mm,
how people who inflict pain on other people ought to feel guilt as well.
right.
But at least in kind of the micro scheme of maybe more neutral or less harmful relational experiences, it still functions in the same way of, oh, there's this burden. I don't feel good. And it leads me towards connection.
Mhm, mm,
And I think that's the important distinction of, sometimes we feel healthy guilt and sometimes we feel unhealthy guilt.
mhm,
And unhealthy guilt leads us to more avoidance, distancing, it pulls us back, and it doesn't lead us to more intimacy. And I think that's where there's room to nuance, there's room to kind of uncouple, like, oh, okay, what do we mean?
right.
Many times in Korean culture, Christian culture, the interaction of both can use guilt tripping or
Yeah.
shaming
Right.
to force someone to do something,
Right.
rather than maybe it's more kind of Western skills, but to have conversations of navigating, well, this was my expectation. What is
Mm,
your expectation?
mm,
Can we negotiate or bargain what we're talking about?
mm. That's really good. It's almost like unhealthy guilt might be something that another person in power might be imposing on you, or forcing you to feel that way, that guilt tripping idea. Whereas maybe healthy guilt might be out of your own recognition, you realize that you need to repair the relationship, right? Yeah. Thanks, Joel. Related to these themes, I know you also have done a lot of good work related to mindfulness and perfectionism. And actually, a previous guest that you know, Dr. Kenneth Wang, talked a lot about perfectionism, because that's, of course, his area. But I also know that you've done good work in this area as well. Can you speak a little bit about mindfulness and perfectionism, and actually how these might go together, how you link these two together?
Yeah, I think it's really connected to what
Mm,
we've already been talking about. So Dr. Kenneth Wang was on my dissertation committee.
mm,
I learned perfectionism from him. I learned mindfulness from my former advisor, Dr. Joey Fong, both who
mhm,
are at Fuller. And my dissertation was trying to mend these two large constructs together, at least in my mind.
mm,
And as far as I know, one way to define perfectionism is we set high standards for ourselves.
mm,
And at times it can be unhealthy when we feel constantly like we're underperforming or underneath that standard. So we have this discrepancy.
mhm,
And when I started to look at the literature on this discrepancy portion, that often drives a lot of the negative outcomes like mental health symptoms, poor self-esteem, even though that they're performing really highly, if you feel discrepancy or perceived discrepancy, I started to think that, well, it could be helpful to be more aware of those standards and be more accepting of the kind of accomplishments, the kind of work ethic that one has, despite whether you think or feel like you're underneath that standard or not.
Thanks for that overview. And mindfulness. So is that sort of the latter part that you described, a relation in relation to perfectionism, sort of that change in your mindset regarding the standard and the discrepancy?
That's right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we can practice mindfulness and meditation. We can practice compassion or self-compassion, and it starts to cultivate an inner sense. It changes our
Mm,
thoughts. It changes our feelings. It can often change the way that we are behaving. First through awareness, then through acceptance, and then through some kind of contemplation of, well, is there a different way to go about this?
gotcha.
And so I think someone who's continuously and chronically getting that 4.0 GPA, or
Mm,
they're receiving grants, or their teaching marks are like wonderful, and
mm,
yet they still feel like they're not meeting their standard, it could be
mm,
helpful to practice mindfulness to be aware of, well, let me consider that all the physical outcomes or the objective outcomes suggest that I'm actually doing quite well.
mm,
What is it about this kind of success that I have a difficult relationship with, and I continue to criticize myself, or I continue to say that this isn't enough, or this didn't meet the standard. Even for a student to be able to recognize, like, wow, I do have that 4.0, but I'm
mm,
just berating myself because I have to study longer than my friend over there who studied less than me. And so
mm.
there's this competitiveness that seems helpful. And at the same time, it can also drive a lot of our mental health symptoms as well.
Right. Thank you. That's really helpful. As you know, many of my listeners are interested in teaching, specifically in relation to religion and spirituality. I know you have experience teaching at a faith-based institution like SPU, and I'm wondering if you can give an example of how you might encourage your students to think about the connection between one or more of the things that we've talked about and spirituality.
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider spirituality and religion when we're working with students who are going to healthcare professions. It could be clinical psychology, it could be counseling, it could even be pastoral counseling. What's important is that spirituality, or some people's Christian theology, could be negative or distorted or kind of defensive as well. That
Mm,
some of our religious and spiritual principles could actually shy us away from emotional pain, emotional experience as well.
mm,
And so, for example, that compassion or self compassion, it could be kind of twisted to suggest that we must never think about ourselves, and we must always think about the other person at the expense of yourself.
mm,
That's important because we want to explore that. We want to be critical about that and curious and wonder about that with our clients as well. So that as counselors or clinical psychologists or psychotherapists, they can gently start to be curious with their clients of, well, okay, that is a part of culture that we don't want to necessarily change, but
mm.
we also want to open up the possibilities if there's something more towards wellness and well-being.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the idea of counseling or therapy and how there's so much individual or self-focus in that setting. But at the same time, because of cultural influences, some of our clients might be thinking about self-care in a very particular way. And so what you're describing, I think, captures all of those complexities. I know we also, this is switching gears a bit, but I
Mhm.
know we collaborated on a chapter and it's still in progress. And but we presented on this topic as well, supporting students during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what was really cool was we had so many different ways and very department specific ways because taught in the clinical psych program. I teach in the undergraduate psych program. And then Mooney Shea, who was our third collaborator at that time, was teaching in School of Education. So it was really neat to see the different ways that we supported our students during the pandemic. But actually, the focus of the chapter was more on through these supportive efforts, how did it affect us as faculty? So can we talk about sort of some of your reflections from that chapter, which were really insightful? For instance, what was something that was really difficult for you during the COVID-19 pandemic teaching? And then how did you respond to that challenge?
Yeah, that worked. The scholarship that we did between us three was fun.
Mm,
It was hard in the sense that it was the pandemic, and so anything that we're trying to do seemed challenging.
mm,
But I think it was this kind of expression or manifestation of what I needed. And so one of the challenges was just the sense of greater isolation
mm,
and greater feeling of loneliness as an early career psychologist, as a junior faculty. We had moved remotely and online, which of course we had to,
mm.
but just pulled apart like connection, sense of belonging. And I didn't realize how important that is in an institution or in a job.
Yeah. What year were you when we went remote?
Oh, that's a great question. So
Yeah.
I started in 2019. The
Okay.
pandemic hit in 2020.
Oh my
And so
goodness.
in my
Mm.
first, at the latter end of my first year into my second year, we moved online.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and the department was really helpful, but of course, everyone is trying to deal with this situation
Yeah.
individually and collectively. And so I was just wanting more, I guess, feedback or reflection of like, okay, am I doing the right thing right now as
Mhm.
a faculty? Am I teaching the right way? It could be so concrete as, is my syllabus okay? All the way
Mhm.
to, am I mentoring students in the right way? And so all of that was really up for question because I
Mhm.
didn't have that immediate relational feedback of just like even a smiling face
Right.
while I'm passing the hallway. And so
Mhm.
and of course, we've talked about perfectionism and self-compassion. So, my psychology is kind of related to being more self-critical. And so if I don't have immediate positive feedback, which
Mm.
I'm kind of a sucker for, then I will start to doubt myself and I'll
Mm.
start to criticize myself. And so in response to that, just reaching out to you and Mandy was really helpful, in addition to many other colleagues, but you both in particular, who are both Asian American psychologists, who are both kind of mid-career, like a little bit more senior than I am,
Mm.
both who had welcomed me into SPU as I was interviewing. It was really great and meaningful to not only do the work, but also just to reinforce that connection that we had together.
Yeah. I think that word connection is so important, but especially for you, Joel, as you were just starting out in many ways. And I'm sure the momentum was building, but then it felt like it was coming to an halt because of that switch to the remote setting. And I remember when it was my first or second or third year, even at SPU, how important it was to be able to talk to people in person and how important it was to just observe people in person and to have none of that during the remote period. I imagine how difficult that must have been as a newer faculty.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I mean, people are kind and generous as much as they can. And it was when someone could show me something, show me some of their work, show me how they would go about a situation. I thought that was really valuable as a junior faculty, as an
Mm,
early career psychologist, just to see, okay, here's another template that I can draw from and I can change it up. And so I don't feel like I have to start from the beginning or from
mm,
scratch.
mm, mm. I remember for me, I didn't mind the online teaching. It was an opportunity for me to develop being on Zoom, using Panopto, all of these things, and thinking about engaging students, even if they are online or remote. I think the part that was really challenging for me was it kind of coincided with I don't want to say like midlife crisis, but maybe a mid-career crisis where I don't know if the pandemic brought that on, but I was like questioning everything I was doing in terms of my scholarship. So not so
Wow.
much my teaching, but like what do I do like with the research interest that I have? Do I have the same level of passion about going through the research cycle again, like collecting data or getting IRB permission, collecting data, and then sometimes data collection can be really difficult, as you know, because we're focused on a very particular population.
Mhm.
And writing that up and helping students also get on board in terms of the project. I, After repeating this cycle so many times, I just found myself during the pandemic questioning, is this something that I want to continue to do, or do I want to take it a different direction? And so it was a time of wrestling with these questions that were almost existential, at least applied to my vocation. So I think my students maybe kind of saw the effects of that as well. Maybe not so good effects where I might have been preoccupied, more jaded, all those kinds of things.
Well, and during that time, that
Yeah.
you had shared to some level those sentiments and those feelings and thoughts with me as
Mm,
well.
mm,
And I found that really helpful because as far as I could see where you were in your career, you had as much success as I would want to aim for. And so to hear someone critically thinking about their career, I think was freeing and liberating because then it allowed me to have not a mid-career crisis, but an early career crisis
mm,
in a positive sense of, okay, I was working really hard in my PhD and I was encouraged to aim for tenure track faculty positions. And
mm,
I did it. I applied and I was able to obtain one. And
mm,
so we moved and there was so much emphasis of getting here that when I got here and I was just about to kind of rev up in my career, the pandemic hit. And I just felt like in a negative sense, it was a complete halt.
mm,
And at the same time, it was a kind of the silver lining, I suppose, is I was able to meet other people who are having very similar experiences who are maybe 5, 10 years ahead of me.
mm,
And I
mm,
thought if they're having similar critical thoughts, then I should have these now.
mm,
And I think that led me to reflect on, well, if I were to continue in this kind of industry, in this kind
mm,
of circular process, there's a lot of good about that. And there's some skills that I want to develop. And at the same time, are those the practices of my life that I want to do for the next 10, 20, 30 years? Like, what
mm.
kind of person do I become
Yeah.
if I continue in this position?
Mm,
And I think that also led me to consider eventually, okay, maybe this position isn't the best for me in
mm,
this season. And what
mm.
else is there?
Right, right.
And I think that what else is really helpful because going back to Korean context, Christian context, like I've never been a good questioner of
Mm,
authority.
mhm,
And so for me to I feel like if I didn't have the pandemic, if I didn't have more senior colleagues like yourself, I wouldn't have had the early opportunity to think, well, what is best for me,
mm,
and not feel selfish about that or guilty about that as well.
mm. I appreciate you sort of sharing that sort of positive takeaway from what I shared with you and what you observed of me, because I also worried at the time about, oh, like if I do share this with someone like Joel, someone who is maybe should be sort of in this very exciting stage of entering academia, a place where in some ways I was at when I first started, like, am I going to be bringing on maybe like an early onset of this sort of crisis that I am experiencing? And so I appreciate you sharing maybe sort of a positive way that you took that. Yeah.
It it was all positive, right? It was all the parts of self compassion of it
Mm.
allowed me to have kindness towards myself. It's like, okay, if someone's successful and older, like Paul, not that much older, but a little bit older
Older.
than me,
Yeah. Yeah.
is experiencing this, then I can be kind to myself. And if
Mm.
Paul's experiencing this, that it must be a shared experience. And if Paul's experiencing then this and I'm experiencing this, that I can kind of it's not just something about my weakness or my inadequacies.
Mm.
There's room for growth. And at the same time, there's something common about this job
Yeah.
that I need to think about. And that allowed me to try to pinpoint like, what about this job do I really like?
Mm-hmm,
And do I
mm-hmm.
have to be a tenure track assistant professor to do those responsibilities?
Right. Right.
And what are the pros and cons doing that in the university versus maybe outside of the university?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Such important questions,
Mhm.
regardless of the if you're early career or mid career, those are questions that we have to continue to ask ourselves. I know the focus of the chapter was also on minoritized faculty experience. Can we speak a little bit about that? I guess, were there particular challenges or rewards as a result of being, for instance, East Asian faculty or faculty of East Asian heritage or faculty of color at our institution?
Yeah. So when we were writing that chapter, and when I was thinking about the chapter, I
Mm,
was reflecting on my experience as someone who's Korean Canadian, now
mm,
immigrated to the US, and kind of putting on this robe of being Asian American now, an East Asian American, because
mhm,
of the tone of my skin and some phenotypic features of what I look like and the background that I had and my parents' immigration story. So all of that comes into play to consider, well, the institution that I'm part of is still predominantly white as far as I can tell. And the field that I'm in is predominantly white. And the city that I live in is predominantly white.
mm,
And there's this kind of raised consciousness of, wow, I look different. I have a
mm,
different background. I have different family values and experiences, some that are similar to, and I want to be open to those pleasant surprises as well. What was helpful when I'm a minority in a situation is that in our institution and our school and department, there were a lot of more East Asian American faculty as well.
mhm,
And so just in the lens of representation and just visualization, like I can see people who kind of look like me. And there's enough diversity where I don't feel like I have to be some kind of pigeonhole. I don't have to be this kind of person, this kind of faculty member. And I think that led to greater sense of belonging. And yet
mm,
there's still that outside, the greater identity of, well, do I belong? Like what is the direction of the board of trustees? What is the direction of the research? And I had a lot of freedom and I love that freedom and trying to dive into more Asian American psychology. And so I think it takes, and then of course the socio-political context of Black Lives Matter,
mm,
anti-Asian hate, these were all revved up with the pandemic. And so there was just so much going on, so much going on outside, inside, and just needing more and more buffers. Again,
mm,
it's coming back to connection and belonging of,
mhm,
well, thank goodness I had at least Paul and not like others,
mm, mm,
because if I didn't, that would be really, really challenging.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, at that time, I was stepping away from serving on a diversity committee, and
Hmm.
I realized that, like, one of the main motivation for stepping away was I realized that I was being, in some ways, viewed as someone who could tackle, like, all dimensions of diversity, which was a very big task. But in that sort of perspective too, that others were seeing me as a particular type of a person, almost sort of a, not a caricature, but like, oh, like he cares about diversity and therefore he must stand here on these things, but here on these other things. And just that students were viewing me that way as well and expecting a certain kind of a stance and to speak up on this particular matter. And all of these expectations based on my minority status really, I think, wore me out. And I thought about, again, self care. And maybe it's time for me to take a break from serving on these committees. And so that's sort of another issue that I grappled with during that time where I had been serving on diversity committees for a long time, leading them, chairing them. And then at some point, I realized maybe this is not, at least for now, the most effective way that I can engage in good DEI and belonging work. Yeah.
Yeah, those kinds of positions and committees are so necessary. And it's challenging because we're trying to encompass the whole human experience. Everyone has some kind of cultural background, some kind of identity, and those
Mm,
identities could be in the majority or in the minority or privileged or not.
yeah.
And so I think the position in some ways is trying to encompass all of human experience, which actually we all ought to be having some kind of stake in. We all ought to be working towards that in our teaching and program administration, in our mentoring and advising of students, in our research. But it can be siloed out. And because it's been siloed out or fragmented or not done well, we
Mm,
do need these committees, at least for the time being. But I hear you that it's really hard work. It's emotionally taxing work. And there could be a kind of tokenism of, well, maybe as long as this person can do all of this work, then we'll be okay. But of course, that person has their own limitations as well and needs their own support.
mhm.
And perhaps what we saw, at least in our institution and department, was that we weren't doing the work as well as we could have.
Mm,
And I kind of leave that up really vaguely, but just like the systems and the processes weren't in place to support each other to begin with.
right.
And so whatever temporary solutions we offered were just temporary and they were very fit.
Mhm.
And what happened was probably an individual or just like a small selected group of people felt that weight and that burden themselves. And again, we go back to like messages of internalization of, well, those people are probably also the ones who are thinking, well, is this my fault? Could I have done something better? But it's like, we didn't have the support. And I think that that's what we try to wrestle with in our book chapter as well, that an ethic of care when we're teaching was initially conceptualized as like the teacher or the instructor to care for the whole being of the student. And when we were reading that work and trying to apply it into our lives, we thought of, well, there's also another context to the teacher and the student. It's not just the teacher and student isolated, but the teacher and student are also within a department, within an institution.
Right.
And if the larger contexts aren't supportive of the teacher,
Mhm.
then how much care can this one teacher muster up themselves?
Right. Right.
And I think the argument we were trying to make is that teachers, and for this book chapter, minoritized teachers or teachers of color, professors of
Mm,
color,
mm.
they're human and they have a certain bandwidth
Yeah.
and they want to care for other people.
Mhm.
They also need to be cared for by the greater institution and their leaders as well.
Very well put. Yeah. I'll just leave that point there because that's so important for our current institution and what we're going through. This is a fun question, which is which class do you enjoy teaching the most and why?
I loved teaching our first. So I was in a PhD clinical psychology program, and I loved teaching our first year clinical foundations 1 and 2 courses because students were coming from all different backgrounds.
Mm,
Some were have been practicing psychotherapy and counseling with a master's degree. Others were like me when I
mm,
started my PhD and just had no experience of psychotherapy
mm,
and was very young. And I tried to structure that course using a deliberate practice framework to practice psychotherapy skills in in a graded approach rather than just flooding them with all of clinical psychology. And
mm,
it was really fun to see the growth of students, the the competence, the self-esteem, the
mm,
self-efficacy just exponentially grow. I don't know how much of it was related to me, but just like students were vulnerable and they were courageous and they tried new skills and they're so passionate knowing that there's a huge need for more professional help in mental health care in the
mm,
community. So I think they're eager to serve and eager to learn as well.
mm. Is that the class that I observed, Joel?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. That was amazing to see you in action. And I do think you created this environment where students were able to safely learn these clinical skills. That graded approach, I think, is a good way to describe it, how you utilize, yeah, small groups, but also the larger class setting. So it was a joy to watch that,
Thank
observe
you.
that. Yeah.
Thank you for your service yet
Yeah.
again in those kinds of capacities.
Well, I enjoyed that experience. Joel, there are three questions that I ask all guests. And so I'll pose them to you. One is, can you describe one thing that you're currently working on that most excites you?
Yeah, right now I've been trying to pivot some of my research and my clinical interests to focus on chronic pain.
Mm,
And what interests me about chronic pain is that there's a type of pain that isn't necessarily related to a bone fracture or a burn on the skin. It's more related to how our brain and our central nervous system gets sensitized to pain around us and fear and more danger signs. And so
mm,
our brain and our sense to our bodies that, hey, there's something going on right now in the environment or maybe within ourselves relationally and emotionally that is causing real pain. And
mm,
so there's lots of great work within, at least within clinical psychology and the field of medicine to examine this kind of pain and to understand how emotion focused or kind of relationally focused psychotherapies could actually help alleviate that pain. And I think there's lots of applications for Asian Americans, for
Mm-hmm.
Christians, other minoritized communities who've experienced unfairness in their lives
Mm.
to be alleviated from certain types of chronic pain. So that's what I'm trying to work on these days.
Ah, so important. Can I follow up on that? Because I'm
Yes.
fascinated by this idea of, because as you mentioned, the chronic pain that I typically think of is the the more commonly discussed pain, which is someone who has a bone fracture and it never heals properly, so experiences pain around that body part throughout their lifetime. But what you're describing, it seems to capture like psychological pain as well, or emotional pain as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So the International Association for the Study of Pain, the IASP, they define pain as encompassing those kind of organic, structural causes of pain,
Mm,
neurological causes of pain. And at the same time, they define pain as an emotional experience, a subjective experience as
mm,
well.
mhm,
And, we know this in the history of psychiatry and clinical psychology, at least, maybe even in the history of pastoral theology of people experience physical pain that's real.
mm,
They're inhibited or something's hard to do in life because of this pain. And yet their body seems to be okay. They've
mhm,
done an x-ray, they've done an MRI scan, they've been
mm,
examined by a primary care provider, and the bone should have healed a few months ago. And then there's different characteristics of this kind of pain where it comes and goes kind of with stress. And when you're
mm,
on vacation, there's no pain,
mhm,
and it's a little inconsistent anatomically. And so this is really interesting to me. John Sarno has done some work. Of course, Sigmund Freud had done some work on
mm,
this. And I'm rereading the history of psychiatry,
mm,
and there's pointers that the early neurologists who started to move into psychotherapy, the neurologists who are so biological and anatomically based, they started to move into talk therapy.
mm,
They were trying to heal and cure these kinds of somatic pains that are real pain that
mhm.
also don't have organic physical causes per se.
Wow. I can see how you can connect that to some cultural processes as well. Thanks for sharing that. You've already touched upon this in some ways, but if you had one advice for someone who is interested in Christian higher education, whether it's new faculty or even advanced graduate student, what might it be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think there's so much of the experience that needs to be experienced.
Mm,
Like one needs real, authentic, firsthand experience to really know, do they want to be in this field or not? Do they want to work in this setting or not? But I think second to that would be to talk with people who are in that setting already and to make real, authentic, deep connections with them to try to learn like the more authentic thoughts that they have. And so I think the kinds of relationships that I was able to cultivate with people like you and to understand, okay, there's some pros and cons to this field.
mm,
There's pros and cons to Christian higher education. There's pros and cons to even higher education.
mhm,
That would be so helpful to learn as an advanced graduate student or as a new faculty
mm,
and then have space and time to reflect on, okay, I made it
mhm,
and I can stay here and I have options as well. And so what am I really chasing? And
mm,
what kind of person do I really want to be? I think those are important questions to have.
mm. Really good. And you, in some ways, had a head start, Joel, because you're a graduate student in Christian higher education. Right? You're at Fuller, but as you experience and as I've experienced as well, that being faculty in Christian higher ed is also different. There are unique challenges to that compared to being a grad student in Christian higher ed.
Right. I think it spotlights
Mm,
the institution and kind of the broader culture of what they really mean by Christian
mm,
and your individual values and traditions of what it means to be Christian and how much does that align?
mhm,
And I don't know if there's perfect alignment for each individual Christian. I mean, there's lots of different Christian higher education contexts,
mhm,
and there's lots of Christian traditions and experiences as well. And so I think that becomes more prominent and salient for the faculty who's working or the staff working at a Christian higher education context. It's like, okay, what's kind of my Christianity or the Christianity that my community has been talking about and thinks
Mhm.
about? And then what is the kind of Christianity that the institution is putting forth? And there's going to be overlap, but there's also going to be a misalignment as well. And so
Mhm.
how am I going to reconcile that as an employee, as a worker, as a person?
Yeah, that's well put. And then I'm also thinking about those differences and how does the institution see that? Do they see that as a deficit that
Mhm,
a faculty member has different views from maybe the official stance of the university? Or do they see that as a gifting? That there's, of course, some commonality, things
mhm,
that maybe are really critical to being part of that community, but then there may be lots of differences on various themes, various issues that sometimes the institution can see that unfavorably, and then other
mhm.
times do they value that? And getting a sense of that kind of a stance, I think would be, in my perspective, really good. Yeah.
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 There's like your highlight. So you're talking, so
Mm,
we've mentioned folding,
mm,
intention, difficult things. And so there's possibly, depending on the perspective, there's a possible tension between orthodox and being ecumenical.
mm, mm,
And the in between of hermeneutics are interpreting what is orthodox and what is like, how are we going to open ourselves up? That, that's, I think has to be done within relationship. We have to have
mm,
dialogue. We have to have time and patience and conversations to mediate. Okay, where are we going to land if that is a false dichotomy or some kind
mm,
of spectrum, but where are we
mm.
going to land and how are we going to live this out?
Right.
How do we be open and also have some kind of at least permeable boundaries of what it means to be part of this institution? And that, yeah, that takes time and effort. And I don't know how you do that easily, but of course that trickles down into kind of your customers, your students,
Hmm,
like the
hmm.
kind of environment and culture that we want to offer students is will be dependent on those kinds of conversation.
Yeah. Well put. So my last question is, without knowing who my next guest will be, I can't think of who that person is off the top of my head. What question might you ask my next guest? And you can really throw a difficult one at them or a fun one. If you're curious about a previous guest question that I really like, so this is actually, I think, from Kenneth. And he asked, what is saving your life right now? So, Joel, maybe you can answer that first and then think about a question that you would like to pose to the next guest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, what is saving my life right now? I think I think this time of rest in between two academic positions
Mm,
is saving my life right now. And I could only do that because of the support of my wife. Let me have some space and time to rest and work on projects that I need. Talk about somatic pain. 2 months after I left SPU, I had like hives and rashes in weird places in my body, and I was in weird pain, and I kind of had to. I'm telling people now that I had to detox from that and
wow.
from academia. So,
Mm,
and when other people tell me like, "Oh, I'm gonna leave academia," or "I'm thinking of leaving," I say, "Hey, like, give yourself a month or two if you can financially, just to rest because we're not always aware of how hard we're working and pushing our bodies."
right.
So I think the rest supported by my wife is saving my life right now.
Mm, mm.
Um,
That's really good. Yeah. So rest, but also the importance of a supportive partner. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. A question for your next guest.
Hmm.
I think what if we asked your next guest in 10 to 20 years, if you were to continue doing what you're doing,
Mm,
what kind of person would you become?
that's really good. Thanks, Joel. This is so good to chat with you. I learned so much from you. I was thinking, oh my goodness, Joel's theological background. I should have taken more advantage and asked more theological questions and learned from Joel. But thanks so much for doing this. Do you have anything else you would like to say before we wrap up our session?
No, thank you for having me. It's always fun having conversation and relating. And I'm seeing the overlap, not only in professional careers, but also
Mm,
personally. Like being a faculty, being a psychologist is so personal. And maybe that's why we're drawn to it.
mm.
And so, yeah, thanks for having these podcasts where people can learn about stories. And I'm always looking forward to more writing that you do, whether you publish online or in a book in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.
Hey, so this happens from time to time. It seems to happen more during my recordings, but there's a yard worker outside and then our dog is going crazy. So
Great.
so you might hear some things in the background. We'll just go with the recording though, so that if it needs to be edited out, we'll try. But
Sure.
please, if it gets in the way, let me know. But you might hear
Okay.
the dog barking. Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Oh, the magic, the behind the scenes. I know.
Well, I don't know if it's the magic more so than like the grind, right? There's some